Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the latest episode of the ESG Show. The ESG Show is a weekly event in which we talk to people who work in ESG professionals, people who are interested in ESG, and the wider community as well, who just got that kind of, well, what is this ESG thing anyway? It's an opportunity for us to discuss topics in some depth. And it's also an opportunity, I think, for us to sort of rehearse some of the criticisms of ESG and to fly the ESG flag, to evangelize ESG to the wider community. Now, one of my favorite movies is the film The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, a Western directed by Sergio Leone. So there's the music if you're not familiar with it. It's a movie I wouldn't hesitate to recommend to anyone who hasn't seen it and is willing to invest 3 hours of time and doesn't mind a bit of violence in their movies. Now, a common theme in the movie is the line, "There are two types of people in this world, my friend," and then it's the following line. For example, those who come through the door and those that come through the window, or those with loaded guns and those who dig.
You see, in this world, there's two kinds of people, my friend. Those with loaded guns and those who dig. You dig. When?
So that wonders of technology, that worked remarkably well. So I would like to paraphrase that and say there are two types of people in this world: those who watch the ESG show and those who live in ignorance of such an incredible experience. This morning, I am being joined by 3 scintillating guests, and one of those guests will be co-hosting the event with me, and that is Rob Cheesewright.
Hi, Michael. Hi.
Hello, Rob. How are you today?
Very good, thank you.
Good. Now, Rob is an environmentalist and experienced media commentator. In 2021, Rob joined the climate tech startup Pinwheel, where he is Chief Impact Officer. He led the development of Pinwheel's proprietary environmental project impacting rating tools. Previous to Pinwheel, Rob was Policy and Communications Director, Britain's most ambitious net zero behaviour change campaign, Smart Energy GB, and a policy advisor and within UK government, primarily working on climate change policy.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me on the show.
That's my pleasure, Rob. Now, so the theme of the show today is the good, the bad, and the ugly of ESG. So which one are you?
I'm a millennial. I have no idea what film you're talking about. We don't watch films. We just watch YouTube. This is. I'm lost.
Okay, fair enough. Touche, I suppose. Well, if you want to know my opinion, I don't think any of our guests this morning are bad or ugly, but they're not good either. They're just amazing. The exception to that is me. I seem to recall in one of the Sergio Leone films there was a character called Baxter, so I suppose that will be me. Now, Rob, over to you.
Fantastic. And so it's now my turn to swiftly introduce our next guest, which is Grant Griffiths. That's not Grant?
Yeah, I'm not Grant. I can vouch for that. But yeah, I'm Prachi, and hopefully Grant will be joining us soon.
Hello, Prachi. Now, Prachi is a London-based ESG consultant. She helps corporate clients across industries in developing their ESG strategies and disclosures. She's been working with banks and financial institutions in the decarbonisation of their lending portfolios across Europe and India. She also supports a small and medium businesses and startups in kicking off their sustainability journey. Through her own venture, Eco Earth, She's also been coaching young professionals who wish to work to make meaningful careers in the sustainability domain. So, Prachi, what advice would you give to young professionals who wish to make a meaningful careers in the sustainability?
Yeah, I would say ESG is a very evolving domain. It's changing every now and then. We have new standards, new framework coming up. So I'll suggest everyone who wish to make a career in this area to read as much as you can, be in touch with the latest happenings, and try and understand the depths of the thing. So just knowing the full form of ESG and knowing the full form of different frameworks is not going to get you far, right? Try and understand the technical details of various things, and specifically about carbon accounting.
Okay, thank you, Prachi. Now, we are having some technical hitches our end, I'm afraid. We've got very slow internet access, but we're going to try and reintroduce Grant to you, or Rob is going to try and reintroduce Grant to you. Grant, are you there?
Well, let me jump in Grant's absence. I will introduce him nonetheless, so you will know who is going to appear. So Grant is an internationally recognized non-executive director, enterprise risk and resilience and ESG professional. So a real powerhouse in this area. He has held senior executive and board roles in some of the world's leading organizations in energy, natural resources, engineering, construction, manufacturing, technology. And these days, he works with client organizations, including G20 governments around the world, helping them to understand ESG, risk, resilience, and how that can be applied to innovation and success in what is an increasingly complex and uncertain world. So, Grant, hopefully you're with us now.
And
you
bingo.
Understand ESG risk. Please tell us about that.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Michael. Thank you, Prachi, for filling in. But yeah, just to give you a really quick answer, in short, I try and make ESG easy, especially for businesses. But I've been at the sharp end, both as an executive and as an advisor and consultant now for a number of years. And as a risk manager, which I suppose is my real profession, my real love in life, I've worked with many organizations around the world on enterprise risk and also governance. ESG has come up, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, as a really hot topic. And when you work with CEOs, you know what it's like. They're trying to juggle a lot of things, make a lot of decisions, get the strategy right. And along comes this thing called ESG. And so then they start to come and ask, what is it about ESG? What do you know? How can you help us? And then, they've heard 20 different opinions on what it is and what they should be doing. And they try to play whack-a-mole. And really, I try and make it easy. And I think there's a few simple steps. I love to use the old KISS principle, and we'll come onto that a little bit later.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Prachi. And thank you, everyone, for bearing with us with a few technical hitches this morning. Before we move on, I just want to very quickly just talk about next week's ESG show, where we will be talking about, among other things, the practical steps in implementing sustainability. And I will be joined by Swetan Gunga, an executive coach and ESG consultant. And from Australia, Chris Mentor, who is a co-founder of Getting to Zero, a consulting firm that helps Australian businesses measure and report their GHG emissions and forecast their journey to zero emissions. And co-hosting will be the only ESG speaker in the world who is literally fantastic, Sheila Fantastic. And the show will be broadcast at an earlier time, 11 a.m. BST, 6 a.m. Eastern Time, and 6 p.m. SGT time, that to accommodate our Australian guest. Rob, over to you. I believe there's some news stories that have caught your attention.
Yeah, so this is the section where we cover some of the main ESG news from the last few days. And this morning I spotted a story in The Guardian around Chevron's worthless carbon credits. And recent analysis by Corporate Accountability has found that almost all of the carbon credits that Chevron has been buying are worthless. And this, of course, comes hot on the heels of another Guardian expose back in January, which showed that 90% of RED Plus projects, which make up the largest type of carbon credit, are also likely to be worthless. What's interesting about this is that the Chevron projects are largely large energy infrastructure projects, which are the second largest. So we're now in a world where something like 70% of all of the carbon credits on the market are very difficult for sustainability experts to buy, because it's looking highly likely that some of them aren't delivering what they say on the tin.
Thank you, Rob. Because of our technical hitches, normally you would see an image at this point of the article, but I'm afraid you're going to have to pretend that you've seen the image this morning. And I believe there was another story that caught your attention, Rob. ASA to ban adverts making misleading climate positive claims.
Yeah, and in a way, this is part of a golden thread that runs through what's going on in the world of sustainability. Because if on one side we're seeing the carbon credits coming under serious scrutiny, we're now starting to see regulators look at this very carefully. So the European Parliament has said that they are looking carefully at carbon neutral claims, particularly where they're backed by offsets. And in the UK, the Advertising Standards Authority is saying the same thing. Essentially, it is going to be very hard to make these easy carbon neutral claims using cheap carbon credits. Any claims based on credit are going to have to be incredibly carefully bought and incredibly carefully couched for public consumption. Otherwise, you will fall foul of regulators, greenwashing. And more importantly, actually, you'll be doing a bad job for your own brand. One of the things that sits underneath this for the ASA is that they've done a lot of research with consumers and have found that consumers find the whole thing deeply confusing. They don't understand that net zero and carbon neutral don't quite mean the same thing. And when they find that a lot of these carbon neutral claims are underpinned by carbon offsets, they're pretty annoyed. So if you actually really want to impress consumers and stand out as a brand, as well as avoiding big corporate risk, these kind of carbon credit backed carbon neutral claims are going to be very difficult to make in the future.
Thank you, Rob. I don't, Prachi, I don't know if you have anything to add to that particular discussion about the advertising issue.
Yeah, I think as far as my understanding goes, these now also apply to all kind of generic labels like eco-friendly, organic, natural. You cannot just go out and like claim that you're biodegradable or something like that. This needs to come with proper evidence and proper data. So I think that's a very welcome step.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, well, I've got good news and bad news this morning. The bad news is that we have had some technical issues. The good news is that despite having technical issues and despite the fact that the worst case scenario of us losing internet connectivity on our host computer this morning, the show carries on. So that's good news, because really wasn't sure what would happen if in the event that occurred. Well, it seems it's not too bad. Anyhow, there's one more story we wanted to talk about this morning, and this is going to lead us to something a little bit more controversial. Now, the story concerns Vauxhall looking to threatening to close factories over Brexit. The article in question says the international automotive giant behind Vauxhall has warned that it could close its British factories with a loss of 2,000 manufacturing jobs unless the government renegotiates incoming post-Brexit trading rules on sourcing batteries for electric vehicles. The warning was made to a parliamentary inquiry by Stellantis, the company behind the Vauxhall, Peugeot, Citroën, Fiat and Jeep brands, and has prompted Kemi Badenoch, the Business and Trade Secretary, called a meeting with industry leaders. Now, Grant, I think you've got something quite interesting to say about this, not specifically about Brexit, but about the issue of electric vehicles and batteries.
Yeah, well, I think, again, Michael, it's one of these classic cases of political decisions. And in this case, if we look at phasing out internal combustion engines and these target dates, 2030, 2035, and this big drive towards electrification. And look, I'm a great fan of electrification. My background is electrical engineering, but it really requires, more advanced, really well-considered, economically viable planning and action to make sure that we can get affordable, readily available, reliable electricity and electrical infrastructure in place. And of course, with that, sometimes we need other related infrastructure as well. And there's a whole backstory there. But we just don't have the infrastructure right now. And of course, what we see is this knee-jerk reaction to things like political targets being put in place. And I think just To go a little bit briefly to the Brexit aspect of it, we don't see much, intra-government cooperation here. It seems to be a lot of political posturing, which we get with politicians. Too much time talking about doing things, not enough time on doing it, because these investments take years and years to execute. So you need political certainty, you need regulatory certainty if you're going to go forward. So we look at, National Grid, the sorts of players here, the distribution companies, what they need to do, as well as the Gencos in the UK. And then, of course, we have this great argument then, let's assume EVs are great, we can all plug them in, we can all, improve our mobility, life as usual, 10, 20, 30 years down the track. The sources of the metals for the batteries in EVs. Some of the people who are involved in the, and I'll use it in inverted commas, mining of these precious minerals and metals, they have appalling working conditions. So we're chasing the E here, but what about the S? Where is society and where are governments here making sure people aren't getting hurt and aren't being, exploited and taken advantage of in extracting these minerals and metals that we need for EVs?
Yeah, thank you, Grant. Now, I think this is a really important point. I was at a conference quite recently about renewable energies, and someone brought up a very similar point about the issue of mining of lithium and so on. And unfortunately, despite the fact that there was an illustrious panel, I don't think anyone really grappled with that issue particularly well. And I think that's a shame, because that is important. And you can see we're back to normal now. Here's the image of the Vauxhall story for those of you who missed it. Now, Prachi, Rob, on the issue of lithium mining, do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, I believe that, not specifically for mining, but this is happening with a lot of products that there's generic claims that product A is better than B, and the same goes on for lithium ion batteries or other batteries, or say cobalt mining. And what we really need is evidence-based life cycle assessments that can really prove that what product is better throughout the value chain, from its cradle to grave, versus the other products. So, yeah.
From a big picture perspective, I think one of the things that environmentalists, and I think I consider myself one, have got to get to grips with is the idea that for net zero, we are going to need to build a lot of things. And that is going to incur some costs. And whilst the level of mining involved in fossil fuels is a massive multiple more than what will be required for one-offs like an electric car, these are real. And we're seeing it in the UK with a lack of response to the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, a lack of response to the European packages on this, an unwillingness to build things that are quite important for net zero, like something like High Speed 2, which ought to replace internal air travel in some respects. Unless we get comfortable building things and dealing with some of the trade-offs with that, we are not going to be able to meet net zero.
Okay, it does occur to me with lithium mining, though, isn't it kind of like a lesser of two evils? Yeah, there are lots of issues with lithium mining, but then traditional, there are issues with traditional fossil fuels as well. And isn't not the case that there are problems with it, but there are even bigger problems with fossil fuels?
But I think if we look at fossil fuels, the more traditional sources, and even if and I include in that coal mining, for example, and other things, these traditional activities, if we look at upstream right through to downstream, everything in between, these organisations, they're very mature and they come under a lot of scrutiny in recent decades. So I think there's a lot more transparency there. And I think generally speaking, we've seen them, take quantum leaps in terms of improving everything from working conditions through to actually getting a lot of carbon and a lot of pollutants out of the entire value chain. And there's one other thing to keep in mind here as well. Battery technologies are still evolving, and we're looking at use of ceramics and many other things. Now they have their uses in power distribution and transmission. That's one story. Can we get them and can we make them commercially viable, though, for EVs and for mobility? And that's, I think, one of the next big challenges, but it's also a great opportunity as well.
Actually, that's very interesting, because I think lithium-ion, it is a relatively new technology. I think lithium-ion batteries were only invented in the 1990s, if memory serves me correctly. And it's interesting what you said. Coal and oil have been around for so long that the standards, the regulation, they've had years to get it right. Whereas with lithium mining, I guess we've still got a lot of mistakes to make yet. There's also an issue, though, that I mean, Prachi, you mentioned cobalt earlier. I know that Tesla are actually looking at eliminating cobalt from their batteries. So I suppose that there are multiple answers to the problem of the costs of lithium mining. Okay, and what about the longevity of batteries? So, you know, if a battery doesn't last very long, then the cost of mining the lithium is obviously a huge issue. But if a battery was to last for 100 years, then maybe we can, you know, the cost of that mining kind of becomes less of an issue. I think Prachi, you've got some thoughts about the importance of the life cycle.
Yes, yes. So yeah, as I was sharing earlier, that we really need some evidence-backed research, and like as of now, there's like very limited amount of information available based on life cycle assessment of these different metal mining, and then we also need to account for all kind of different environmental as well as social factors throughout the value chain. So yeah, that would hopefully lead us to better answers and more clear answers.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for that. That was a good discussion. We move on to one more news story. This one concerns Formula One cancelling the Imola GP due to the weather emergency. Rob, I think you had a few thoughts about that story.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating one because obviously Formula One goes to every length possible to not cancel a race. This is a huge deal, and it shows, you know, this is essentially a climate change weather event, and it's a really iconic example of where we're already seeing climate change affect business today, an iconic global business. And the other side of that coin, of course, is that Formula One emits a non-trivial amount of carbon, around 250,000 tons, which isn't massive, but isn't insignificant. And they're, of course, high profile in that. Most of it comes from flights. They've set themselves a 2030 net zero target, but we are not going to have decarbonized airline travel by then. So they've got themselves in a real interesting bind. They're going to have to work out how to solve this problem by 2030, may end up relying on some of the offsets we were talking about earlier, which will be very difficult for them. But also it's affecting their business right now. They've lost one of their races. And so Formula One and climate, both from a mitigation perspective, but also from an impact perspective, is a really fascinating case of something that will affect all our businesses going forward.
Okay, thank you for that. Now we turn to another section of the show in which Grant and then Prachi, Grant speaks to Rob and then Prachi talks to me. Over to you, Rob and Grant.
So welcoming back Grant, who has posed the question, ESG, are we masters of it or slaves to it? And I suppose the first question then, Grant, is do companies really understand ESG and what it means for them? In other words, have they fully considered ESG factors in their strategies, or are they still chasing short-term quick wins that will erode company and shareholder value?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rob, isn't it? I think one of the observations, and certainly things I've experienced, is, as I mentioned earlier, there tends to be this overreaction. There's almost this fear of, we've got to deal with this thing. And that's coming from a lot of pressure from stakeholders. And I use that term deliberately, not just shareholders, but stakeholders. And we're finding everyone's got an opinion, everyone's got a point of view, but we're also finding regulation starting to take quite a big role in this. And of course, driving the motivation of executives and boards. And it's the thing keeping them up at night. And so they tend to want to try and do 101 things, and they go for the quick fix. So, the UN SDGs or some other thing. And what's TCFD look like, and what do we need to do to get some numbers in there? And my advice is always to take a step back from things and start to look at materiality, that very important starting point. And I think it's fair to say that a number of organisations now are starting to get that, and certainly many I've worked with have said, hey, we've got some low-hanging fruit. That's why I like to say keep it simple. Sometimes you need to take a step back and you need to communicate and say, look, it's going to take us a little bit longer to get there, but here's what we're doing. But be able to take those important first steps and demonstrate that you're taking some measurable and some verifiable steps towards making some change.
That's interesting, because I suppose it it's a really interesting answer to how you navigate all of these current policy frameworks laid out by governments and other bodies. You talked about SBTI and TCFD, and there's a myriad of other ones that are in that similar space. Are they fit for purpose? How do we harmonize them and do it in a way that supports our objectives? How can companies navigate that?
Yeah, I think, to give you a very simple answer, Rob, I don't think a lot of them are fit for purpose. And I say that because I think governments tend to go along, and here's my criticism of politicians all around the world. They tend to come along and they come from a very uninformed perspective, a lot of them. Yeah, I can't blame them. Look, they're elected to do a job, and I think most of them do try to do a good job, but I think they're getting pulled in many different directions. And that big fear of being re-elected, and we have to be seen to be doing something, just do anything. So policy tends to be a little bit ad hoc, and as I said before, you need to have absolute certainty and clarity when you're running a business or even a not-for-profit. You need to have certainty and clarity around the rules. But of course, we have this flip-flopping as well. We have this talk about perhaps we'll start to put hydrogen into the gas distribution network. That's fine. There's a massive investment involved with that. There's also higher rates of leakage. There's a lot of discussion around, small modular reactors for nuclear. It's a great solution. But the UK government is actually making some quite considerable strides towards supporting that, more than people realise, but there needs to be more. But again, I think it needs to be communicated to the wider public and to the wider stakeholders as well. And I think there needs to be a lot more common sense come into the debate. But they really need to get, governments everywhere need to get the frameworks right, the policies right, and get them aligned with the long-term investment strategy and get businesses on board, give businesses confidence that we can achieve these goals working together.
Yeah, and then so I suppose then looking at it from an individual company perspective, what do you think is the single biggest thing that's getting overlooked in the world of ESG?
I think it's the rush to meet compliance deadlines. If we look at things like TCFD and a number of others, there's a deadline, particularly for the larger companies, the premium companies, listed companies in the UK and other parts of the world, and we need to put some numbers in a box. And so what they're doing, and this leads a little bit to the challenge that you said before, Rob, the thing that's now become an issue of these green certs that are basically worth nothing. There's no transparency. There's been a lack of governance. The G has gone missing. And so the reach is for the quick fix. And again, we can't blame businesses for doing this. Let's take away the fact they may have boxed themselves into the corner in the first place, but they're trying to find a solution, something they think will work. A lot of it is down to that.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a huge amount of it, aren't we? That sort of focus on, oh my goodness, how do I comply? How do I fill in this TCFD form? And actually not answering the questions, actually, how do I make impact? I really bang on with that. I mean, the ESG credentials and ESG ratings, I mean, there's a sort of debate as to whether they actually improve performance or actually not. I mean, do you think it's fact or fiction that strong ESG companies do better than ones that aren't living the ESG life properly?
Yeah, this is a vexing question, isn't it, Rob? I think, I'm inclined to say there's no real concrete evidence yet. Now, there's a lot of publications and data out there by big consultants and everyone that says, yes, they do. And of course, you'll find Larry Fink and the BlackRocks of the world will say, of course it does. But let's look at the sorts of money they're making out of ESG investments as well. They're charging 100, 200 basis points more in their management fees, and I don't see their salaries going down. But that's a conversation perhaps for the S part a little bit later on. But, I think that the ratings, that there's no consistency in the ratings methodologies. Yeah, I looked at something a few months ago. I was running some workshops. I said, here's one set of ratings, here's another set of ratings, here's another one. And the variance in the top 10 rated organizations, it was incredible. A company that was rated number one in one set of ratings didn't even figure in the top 20 in another. So, go figure, which one do you listen to? Which one do you look at? I think perhaps listed markets, LSE, NYSE, NASDAQ, some of these, for example, probably need to get their heads together a little bit more. Only solves it for listed companies, but it might be a starting point.
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating. I mean, the complexity and of different systems. I mean, the one where Exxon appears better than Tesla in an ESG rating.
Yeah.
So we've seen this stuff, and the sort of slight tyranny of the accountancy over impact thing. I mean, very punchy stuff. And I'd better hand back to Michael on that note.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Tesla. ESG. There's 3 shows on their own to talk about that one. Now I'd like to have a chat with Prachi, and hopefully, Prachi, you are about to appear on the screen, and as if by magic you do. And you're going to be talking about the rise of ESG regulation. So, Prachi, what is the current landscape of ESG disclosure frameworks?
Yeah. Michael, currently we have mandatory regulations that have put forward by different government agencies that mostly the public bodies needs to comply to. But we also have these very vast quantity of voluntary voluntary frameworks that corporates across the world take up and to kind of align their annual reporting to those voluntary standards. And in terms of regulations, we have seen definitely a rise in past 2 to 3 years. We know that in UK TCFD is one of the mandatory framework to report on for listed companies. We have recently seen rise of CSRD, which has come up in European Union, and that is the first time that these regulations have expanded the scope only from public companies to non-public companies as well. So companies that are not listed, but they're still, if they're crossing the thresholds of certain revenues or certain amount of assets in their balance sheet, they still have to report using the standards that are provided by CSRD. And so that is how the landscape is currently going on, and looks like that we will be seeing more such national regulations coming up. Recently, China has declared, Australia have declared that they are also coming up with their own national laws around ESG disclosures. In terms of developing countries, India already have very extensive requirement on ESG disclosure. Japan has one. US definitely has. We have from US SEC. So there are multiple regulations, multiple standards out in the market. It's like a big jumble of acronyms.
And how do they differ? So how are the regulations different from other disclosure frameworks, for example?
So in spirit, there's really not much of a difference. It's just the difference comes up in terms of complying to those. So using the voluntary frameworks, it's up to the companies if they want to do it or do not want to do it. It majorly comes from the industry pressure. It comes from that this is what their investors are expecting, or this is what the consumers are expecting. But when we move towards regulation, it becomes a legal requirement. And so if the companies fail to report to the legal compliances, that may cause risk and certain other legal problems for them. And overall, this is, in my opinion, it's pretty much leading to a web of compliance, where the companies get really torn up into what 10 different frameworks they want to report to, and do not really get a lot of chance to work on actually strategizing, sitting down and thinking that what steps do they need to take for, say, on decarbonization or strengthening their value chains, or what social commitments they need to follow, and just most of the time goes into filling these different frameworks.
Well, I mean, it sounds like a nightmare, though, isn't it? It's so complicated. Do we really need so many different regulations?
It is a very difficult question, actually. On certain points, we kind of do need these different regulations, because there's different industry context and there's different national context, like regional context, but also there is a huge overlap in the requirements of these different frameworks, right? So what we are reporting on CDPs similar to what right? So just it's like repeating the same information again and again in just different shapes. I mean, an ideal would look like where we have regulation might say for industries and for different regions. And we now do have ISSB that is coming up, which has merged SASB, integrated reporting, and CDSB. So that is one very welcome step in streamlining this whole very varied landscape of reporting frameworks and regulations. And I think going forward we can expect more such mergers between these different reporting standards to come up with something which is more global, and it kind of takes care of all these different nuances within the same framework. So companies can put in more time, more energy, and more resources in actually doing something about their ESG performance versus just reporting the same information in 10 different standards.
Prachi, thank you very much. I'd love to talk to you about this for longer, but